Okay, I think we're live here. Hello, good morning and good afternoon and maybe good evening to you, and welcome to another Spider Strategies monthly education webinar. Of course, this is the month of January 2019, and this month we're going to be covering an introduction to scoring and colors in Scoreboard. My name is Tom Keating. I'm honored and pleased to be your presenter today. I'm a training and customer experience consultant at Spider Strategies. And I invite you to feel free to contact me anytime at tom.keating@spiderstrategies.com. Before we get into the actual webinar and the material, just some logistic notes for you. This webinar is being recorded for your future use and reference. All attendees are presently muted. In these sessions, I always apologize for that fact, because I always express I wish this could be more of a dialogue rather than a presentation or a monologue by me. But we've learned over the past months and years that if we leave the phone lines open, there's almost always inevitably some kind of noise pollution that trickles through and kind of, ruins the overall experience in the recording. So with that said, please at any point in time, do feel free to send me any questions or communications to me directly at my tom.keating@spiderstrategies.com or our education email at learn@spiderstrategies.com. Also, before we move on, we're going to be making our first attempt today at the end of the session to stop the recording and then open the phone lines up for any free-form questions that you might have. This is something we've been aspiring to do, and admittedly, today will be our first test of that experience. Hopefully, it works out well. So let's take a look at today's agenda. We will start with a simple review of colors and scores within Scoreboard and the applications in Scoreboard. Then we'll move on to an introduction to normalized scoring and associated colors in Scoreboard. Then we'll introduce you to the various scoring types in Scoreboard. We'll then take a deeper dive review of some of the most commonly used scoring types. We really don't have time today to cover all of them, and I don't think some of them aren't used that frequently. So we'll just be getting a little deeper on some of the more commonly used ones. And then we'll wrap things up with a discussion of how scores are rolled up, the impact of weighting, and some administrative settings that we think you should be aware of regarding scoring in Scoreboard. Okay, so let's jump into just a brief demonstration, which again will just be a review of colors and scores in some Scoreboard applications. I've brought Scoreboard up. Just to give you information here, I've logged into Scoreboard as just a view user, and I've of course landed at the home page. Now, right from the home page, I'm already being presented with some color-coded elements under the new alerts area. And what that does is it piques my curiosity to say, well, I wonder if there are more alerts that I should be aware of. So I'll click on Show Alerts. And here, with a listing of all the various 14 alerts that I have subscribed to for KPIs that I want to track and keep my fingers on the pulse of, I see lots of different colors. And the beauty of the colors in Scoreboard across the board is that it gives you automatic, intuitive, and obvious insight into your performance right off the bat without really needing any kind of training. This idea of red, yellow, and green sort of traffic light coloring is predominant and prevalent throughout all of Scoreboard. So right away, I can see that customer satisfaction survey, the second from the top, is green. And that is pleasing to me because that means that we are overperforming. We are exceeding goals. And if I want to investigate our performance on that single KPI, I can easily click on it. That drills me down into the scorecards section of Scoreboard, where I have a more detailed view of that customer satisfaction survey KPI. And of course, the nice big green speedometer gauge is showing me my performance, the actual performance of 97.2, the score of 8.1, and of course, the fact that the speedometer is largely green is very indicative of very strong performance for this KPI in the month of November 2018. Also on the right, nice color-coded line chart showing me performance historically. I can navigate back through time into previous months and note that the speedometer on the left, the speedometer gauge is of course changing as I go from month to month through some yellow months into red months. And so again, very intuitive presentation of information around this customer satisfaction survey. All based, again, color-based. Over on the left, I see the customer satisfaction survey, the KPI that we're currently looking at. But if I navigate into a different month of, let's say, October 2018, I see that right below it, customer churn has a little red dot. Again, a nice, another color presentation reflecting performance. So that piques my curiosity, and I click on customer churn. And again, of course, that now becomes red across the board on the left. And of course, I'm now viewing that customer churn KPI and its detail. Another opportunity here to review performance over time. And in this case, we've set up the chart to also have some background coloring to further indicate where we have sort of delineations or thresholds between poor performance and medium performance. The poor being in red at the top, the medium being the sort of yellow or beige coloring throughout the rest of this chart. So the idea here again is that the colors very much sort of help drive my investigation of overall performance. And again, it's very intuitive and obvious to virtually any user who understands just the whole paradigm of red being bad, yellow being medium performance, and green being good. I'll navigate back to the home page and again just review where other areas through the home page where color coding is easily available to us. If I move to the right under the Your Responsibilities area and click on KPIs I own, I get a nice little list of all the KPIs that I've been assigned to as an owner. And again, I see the color coding of, again, red, yellow, and green, showing obvious performance levels where I don't even need to dive in too deep to see that average monthly use is green, customer churn is red. Again, we just saw customer churn a second ago, but I also see that total gross profit is red. Now, if I had a very extensive list of KPIs here, I might want to use the obvious filters at the top where I could filter it just to the green or overperforming KPIs. I could filter just the yellow or medium performing KPIs, or of course the red or underperforming KPIs, which presumably I might want to go in and again dive a little deeper and investigate, time-based performance where, for instance, total gross profit, for some reason we've just dropped completely off the cliff here between September and October of 2018. I'll jump back to the home page and just go down to the KPIs I update. The idea here is, of course, I am the updater of certain KPIs within this scoreboard application. And again, the color coding again comes into play as I review historical performance of these KPIs that I'm responsible for updating. Presently, we're looking at October of 2018, and I can easily see that product revenue is middle performing, training revenue is underperforming, and book revenue is overperforming as compared to the thresholds that have been defined in the setup of the scoring system. If I move ahead into November and December, of course, those values and the colors presented may, of course, change depending on performance. Then if I move ahead into January, where I have not yet provided updated values for any of these KPIs, of course, we don't see the same under period color coding because we don't have actual values. But over on the right, again, a nice color-based visual indication of the two goal and red flag thresholds that have been set up around those distinct KPIs. So that's a sense of where, the color coding, which is tied again back to the scoring, the normalized 0 to 10 scoring that is prevalent throughout Scoreboard, is indicated from your home page. Other areas where colors, of course, come into play is within the various types of applications that you can create within Scoreboard. So in this case, I'm opening up a briefing or a briefing book, and we'll just review some performance via our briefing book. I'll go ahead and make it a full screen presentation of the briefing book. And again, I've got nice color-coded or color-based presentation of a variety of KPIs. Again, as I navigate over time, again, you'll see that the performance changes month to month. And again, I have a very simple and intuitive understanding that as I go month to month, I see that leads down towards the lower right is just consistently underperforming. And that is something, of course, that I can then drill into and try and gain some better understanding of how our performance has evolved over time. And in this case, it just seems to be continually descending. And that's of great concern. And of course, something that I would now address. And then at this point, I'll jump back in to the larger briefing and just navigate to other pages just to show you some other very straightforward and intuitive examples of where the colors give you insight into your performance without necessarily needing to see very minute details. In this case, of course, anything that's green, again, shows an overperformance or exceeding goals or expectations. Red, of course, is underperforming and not meeting expectations. And again, as I change again, the time periods, you'll see the colors change. And again, without needing detailed information, I have a very intuitive understanding of our performance across these different KPIs in the different time periods. Moving ahead, just another example of a simple report here. Again, the color coding comes into play where I have lots and lots of detailed numbers for lots of different KPIs. And if I want to just quickly understand which of these numbers are overperforming or underperforming or middle performance, I can easily just hover over the row for any given KPI. And the color coding, again, gives me immediate intuitive understanding of performance. All right, so I'll stop there. And then we'll bring back up my PowerPoint. So that is just, again, a quick review, if you will, of where colors and scores appear and help you gain immediate insight in your scoreboard applications. The next couple agenda items we'll cover together are an introduction to normalized scoring and the associated colors in Scoreboard, and an introduction to the various scoring types in Scoreboard. Before we get into that, the basics of scoring in Scoreboard. KPIs and their associated 0 to 10 normalized scores and colors are very much the foundation of how performance is tracked and visually presented in Scoreboard. A Scoreboard performance management solution, what it does is it assigns a normalized score number between 0 and 10 and a color associated with that score to any actual performance values that are provided for any given KPI. And this is important that it's according to the scoring type and thresholds that are assigned to that single or individual KPI. So a question that is very often asked about normalized scoring in Scoreboard is effectively, why do we do it? Why do we employ 0 to 10 normalized scoring as opposed to other approaches to, managing and understanding performance? Well, the answer is that to really appreciate and evaluate overall business performance across myriad different enterprise KPIs, you really need a common or shared scoring system to be able to equitably compare business apples to business oranges and even to business bananas. So in this case, I'm just sharing with you a couple of representative KPIs that a lot of our customers track, something as simple as sales revenue, customer churn, and profit percentage. And these are, of course, distinct and separate and unique KPIs that are measured in different ways. So for a given, let's say, month period of time, we may have sales revenue number of 550,000. For customer churn, we have an actual value of 80. We lost 80 customers in that month, and our profit percentage number for that particular month was 33%. And that's great that we have all of these numbers, we've tracked the KPIs, and we have the actual values. But the question is, how are we really performing as an overall multi-division enterprise? And what you can do through the Scoreboard system is convert the actual values to a common normalized score, and then use those normalized scores to come to a broader understanding of overall enterprise performance, which in this case, across those three distinct KPIs, would be 5.33. And that just comes together quite simply via an average of the normalized scores, right? The 6 plus the 2 plus the 8 is 16. Divide that by 3, and you get your score, overall performance score of 5.33. So that's the why behind it, is to give us, if you will, a common or shared playing field where very distinct KPIs can all be evaluated together to gain overall understanding of enterprise performance. So how do you set up normalized 0 to 10 scoring in Scoreboard? Well, obviously you start by identifying a KPI that you want to track and measure. That KPI, of course, has a sense of very bad performance, very good performance, and somewhere in the middle, sort of a medium performance. And this is going to be based on your understanding of your KPIs in your business. We at Spider Strategies can't dictate what actual performance values for you are very bad, what are very good. You know your business, you know your KPIs. So you identify in advance those different sort of, if you will, performance levels, and then you use the scoring system in Scoreboard to assign or translate those actual performance values to a normalized 0 to 10 score. Okay? Some examples of that might be sales revenue. where, you know, you identify that if, in terms of sales, if you ever dip down to just 100,000, let's say, per month, that is just terrible. You can barely keep the lights on and the doors open. And so that would be aligned or associated with a normalized score of 0. Whereas your goal or your aspirations are to, you know, make 750,000 per month, and that would then again be associated with a normalized score of 10. And somewhere in the middle is going to get, you know, a normalized score somewhere between 0 and 10. Another example might be customer churn, where it's sort of the polar opposite of the flip-flop of whether big numbers are good versus small numbers bad that we saw in the sales revenue. So in customer churn, it'd be great if we lost 0 customers. So that would be associated or aligned with a normalized score of 10. If we lose 80 customers, that's terrible. So that would be aligned or associated with a normalized score of 0. And again, the whole spectrum in between 0 and 10 would be tied to actual churn numbers between 0 and 80. And then one last example is a little bit different than the last two, but in this case, a warehouse inventory type KPI, where what you want to do is just maintain some ideal number of, you know, let's say widgets in your warehouse, where you want to keep 400 in stock ready to go. If you dip down to 200, you know that that's probably not enough to have on hand. If you go up to 600, that's too many, way too many to have on hand. So in this case, the ideal number of 400 would be aligned with the normalized score of 10, and the other numbers would be aligned with the poor 0 normalized score. Okay? Now, once you have identified and aligned performance numbers with normalized performance values with normalized scores, the question is, how do you want to present those and color them in terms of breaking up the 0 to 10 normalized score spectrum appropriately, both numerically and associating them appropriately with colors. So the most commonly employed method is to take the 0 to 10 and break it up into thirds with a goal and a red flag, or a 3-color scoring methodology. This again represents the classic, I always call it traffic light scoring paradigm of red, yellow, and green. You may, however, decide that you don't really need that red and yellow and green. You just want to know if something is underperforming in red, overperforming in green. So you have an option to just do 2-color scoring. Another option with regard to the kind of binary red or green is a methodology of goal only or yes, no, where instead of assigning a number somewhere between 0 and 10 to an actual performance value, that value is either evaluated to be 0 or 10. Nothing, no gray in between. It's either black or white. Another option might be to say, let's expand beyond the 3, you know, red, yellow, green, and let's throw in an orange color and break down our 0 to 10 a little more distinctly into 4 different buckets instead of the 3 buckets that you do with the goal and red flag. And you also, back to that sort of warehouse inventory example, again, you may want to sort of employ what we call a stabilized scoring methodology, where outliers are, you know, zeros and the ideal number in the middle is a 10. So the idea here is that that's just an introduction to some of your choices within Scoreboard. Oh, and you can also get even a little more detailed with the stabilized scoring approach to say not only red but also yellow and green around, again, that idealized centralized value, which would be associated with the normalized 10. Okay, so scoring types. Scoreboard gives you the opportunity to take advantage of up to 11 different scoring types, giving you many options for associating your actual performance with your normalized score and the coloring from that normalized score. Here they all are. I'm not going to read them at you. We're not going to, again, take the time today to cover all 11 of these various scoring types, and instead what we'll do is we'll focus our attention as we move forward into a deeper dive review of the most commonly used scoring types. Okay? So what we'll do today is dig a little deeper by reviewing and comparing and contrasting these 7 different scoring types: goal and red flag in 3-color, goal only, yes, no in 2-color, 2-color stabilized, and unscored, which is something that we really haven't mentioned the unscored one yet, but it is important to certainly to know about. Okay. All right. So first of all, the most commonly used types, again, within Scoreboard are either goal and red flag and 3-color. In either case, what you're going to be doing is setting up this idea of actual performance values tied to underlying normalized scores with a worst value, a red flag value, a goal value, and a best value, which again will be translated to the normalized scores of 0, 3.33, 6.67, and 10. When you're setting up the goal and red flag scoring, what you do is you provide a goal value, a red flag value, and the software automatically, Scoreboard automatically aligns those goal and red flag values with the normalized numbers of 6.67 and 3.33. And in terms of coloring, anything that falls in between the normalized score of 3.33 and 6.67 will be colored yellow. The software also, Scoreboard also acknowledges the difference between the goal and the red flag, the numeric delta, if you will, between those two numbers. And it logs that and then automatically uses that same difference number to automatically, systematically define the worst threshold or the worst value, which in this case, of course, 500 minus 300 is your 200 as a worst threshold. And then it adds that same difference to the goal value to define the best threshold, in this case of 1100. Now, the key takeaway from setting up a goal and red flag is that you only have to define the goal and the red flag, right? The system, Scoreboard system, automatically defines the worst and the best actual threshold values, and it's all based upon the difference between the red flag and the goal actual values. And that can be great because you only have to provide two numbers. You just have to provide goal and you just have to provide red flag, and Scoreboard takes care of the rest. But there may be situations where you want a little more control over what you define as worst or what you define as best. So in that case, if you still want the paradigm of 3 colors, but you want control over your worst and your best, what you again in the 3 color scoring do is set it up with a goal and a red flag. Again, each of those thresholds will be aligned with the normalized score of 6.67 and 3.33. It again has a 300, in this case, unit, let's say, difference between the goal and the red flag. But going forward, it's your job to define the worst value. In this case, we set it at 0. And it's your job to define the best value, which will be aligned with 10. So 0 will go to normalized 0. 1500 will be a normalized score of 10. And again, the primary takeaway or the big difference here is, again, that you get to define the worst and the best thresholds for the actual values, regardless of that difference between the red flag and the goal values. Okay? Now, with regard to scoring, the scoring that occurs of an actual value with that goal and red flag setup that we just discussed, if we take that whole setup of 800 as the goal, 500 as the red flag, the system generated 200 worst and the system generated 1100 best, and we provide an actual performance value for a given month of 1,000. It will be scored at 8.89. And the question here is, how and why did it get to 8.89, right? The answer is that actual value of 1,000 lands 2/3 of the way through that 300 unit difference between the goal and the best. So because it lands 2/3 of the way through that, the idea is that 2/3 of 3.33 equals 2.22. And if you take and add that 2.22 to the 6.67 goal normalized score, you end up with 8.89 for the normalized score for an actual value of 1,000. Now, if we take that exact same 1,000 actual value and put it into our 3-color scoring system, where we, as you know, the people that set this up, defined our own worst at 0, our own best at 1,500. What does 1,000 get in this? It gets a normalized score of 7.62. And again, the answer, or the question of why 7.62, in this case, that actual value of 1,000 lands 2/7 of the way through that 700 unit difference between goal and best. 2/7 of that 3.3 normalized score difference between goal and best equals 0.95. And if you add the 0.95 onto the 6.67 of that goal threshold, you get 7.62 for the normalized score of that 1,000 actual value. And I hope that's straightforward to you. This is the point in this type of presentation where I really wish I could pause and ask questions, but can't do so. So I'm just going to have to hope that that all makes sense to you. All right. So what we want to do at this point is just actually get into Scoreboard and just review the setup of a goal and red flag and of a three color score setup. Now I have to log in as a little more of a powerful user than I was logged in earlier, so bear with me a second while I log in. And what we'll do is go into the scorecards section of Scoreboard, and I'll open up an organization that was set up specifically for this webinar, which is my January scoring webinar. And we'll open up the January scoring webinar scorecard and a KPI area where I have all of the various different scoring type KPIs already set up for our investigation and review. And what we'll do is go to the goal and red flag KPI. And of course, you know, it's going to show us performance. In this case, I'm looking at the month of December 2018. Just like we saw earlier, I, of course, can navigate and work, you know, with this KPI. But our goal here right now is to talk about the setup of this goal and red flag KPI. So down towards the bottom of the black navigation pane, I'll click Edit. So I'm now in edit mode for the goal and red flag KPI. We'll just review all of the various properties of this KPI by, of course, just reviewing its name. It's, of course, been set up as a KPI. We did provide a description here. In this case, it's giving you the literal description of how a goal and red flag scoring works. Weight is a property that's very important to know about in terms of scoring, because this is where any particular KPI is defined with a weight in terms of how that KPI is used when rolling up the higher levels within the scorecard hierarchy. We'll come back and talk about weight a little bit later, but I just want to touch on the existence of this weight property right here. And again, like I say, we'll come back to that just a little bit further down the road here in today's webinar. Moving down the screen, some KPI details. The scoring type is, of course, extremely important to select and define appropriately. Here is where you see the listing of all the 11 different scoring types that I alluded to. And I'll tell you right now that what you select here is going to dictate changes within the setup screen. So right now, this is, of course, set up as a goal and red flag. If I were to change this to yes/no, note that in the series area, all I can do right now is just, if I wanted to, provide the setup of an actual value. If I change it to color, I now have a couple different fields where I can provide a worst, a goal, and a best. In this case, I'm just going to put it back to the goal and red flag because that is the setup that we desire for this particular KPI. The calendar is, of course, where you tell Scoreboard how often you expect that KPI to be updated. In this case, it's monthly. The data type is pretty straightforward. It's either a number, a percentage, or a currency. The aggregation type is one of the more probably confusing areas of the setup of a KPI when you're thinking about how elements are scored and or rolled up. And a very common misunderstanding, or misconception, I should say, amongst our customers is that this aggregation type has any impact at all really on how scores are rolled up as you go from a measure level up to a KPI area level up to, whoops, sorry, I shouldn't have clicked there, up to a scorecard level. Now, what aggregation type does is it tells Scoreboard how to aggregate the actual values, the red flag values, and the goal values if and when you change time periods or periodicity when working with this measure within Scoreboard. So to just illustrate that, I'm going to leave the aggregation type set at sum, and I'm going to remove myself from edit mode. I'm not going to save any changes. What the aggregation type property applies to is your calendar period selector choice towards the upper right. Okay. Right now, I'm viewing this goal and red flag KPI at a monthly periodicity. I see that over on the left, I've got the score of 8.9, a red flag value of 500, a goal value of 800 for the month of December 2018. If I change my periodicity to quarterly and show the results, note that a couple things have happened. The score, of course, the actual value, of course, is summing the 3 months that feed into quarter 4. The red flag value, threshold value, has increased to 1,500, and the goal threshold value has increased to 2,400. And that is occurring because this Q4 represents, 3 months worth of values. So it's summing them all up. And if I change this again to even a larger time period of yearly and show results, note that the numbers again have continued to increase. So the red flag threshold is now 6,000, because that's 12 times 500, which was the monthly red flag value was 500. And again, the monthly goal value was 800, and it's being multiplied again by 12. So that my point here is that the aggregation type, let me just jump back here to monthly and show the results. Back in the properties here for this goal and red flag, this aggregation type setting controls how a given measure is presented and aggregated when you're working with that measure after it's been created. It does not control how a particular KPI is rolled up. So in this case, we've got all these different scoring types here under all scoring type KPIs. And what the all scoring type KPIs is doing is it's rolling up all 13 of these different distinct KPI measure types up into this all scoring types. And it's going to do that by taking a weighted average. Every time, all the time, it's going to use a weighted average. My selection or property setting for goal and red flag for the aggregation type is not going to impact how actual scores are rolled up to higher levels, to superior levels within your scorecard. Okay? Moving on, decimal precision is pretty straightforward, and units, of course, is available to you. Now, with regard to the series down here, this is where you can define your goal and red flag for a goal and red flag KPI. Of course, you've got choices in terms of how you set these up. The most common is just to set the numbers manually. So if you set manual, then you get the opportunity to define a number as your red flag threshold. If with regard to goal, leave it at manual. You can set up with it, for instance, 800. Now, you do have other choices. One is calculated, one is roll-up. Roll-up is very infrequently used. It only is used when creating a KPI within a scorecard that is intended to serve as a template, a hierarchical template that will be replicated and reused again and again in other areas of the business. So again, the roll-up selection is very, very infrequently employed. Most typically, it's set up as manual or, in certain cases, calculated. And I'll just show you an example here of a simple example of calculated. A lot of times our customers come to us and say, look, I understand the idea of goal, but I do want to use the goal and red flag scoring method, but I don't know what my red flag value should be. We don't really have it. What we'd like to do is maybe take 80% of goal and make that our red flag. So if that's the case, what you can do is change it from manual to calculated and set an equation where you point to a KPI, and the KPI that you're going to use is this very same KPI. You're going to use its actual value, and you're simply where'd you go? Add. Uh-oh, that's not working. Cancel out of there. 800. Hold on, bear with me. I'm not sure why that's happening here. Okay, select the KPI. We'll use this KPI. Done. Use its actual value. Oh, sorry, it's goal. There we go. Sorry, goal. And select add. And then multiply that by 0.8. So in that case, I have defined a red flag value that is going to be 80% of whatever the goal is set up to be. So that's just a very simple example of setting up a calculated red flag value. In this case, I do want to set it to be manual at 500. Moving on, of course, with any KPI, you can assign owners and updaters. In this case, with regard to the updaters, one last little point here about updating measures is if you set up an updater, you can optionally give them the opportunity to update or change the threshold by simply putting a check in the update thresholds box over on the right. If that is not checked, then someone who's an updater will not be able to change the red flag and goal values. Those will effectively be locked in. There may be situations where month over month, the red flag and goal values do change, and it would be appropriate for an updater of this KPI to be able to manually change those while they are updating actual values as well at the end of any given particular month. Okay? So that's an example of the goal and red flag. I'll just cancel out of that because I don't want to really actually change it. Let's take a look at the 3-color difference. So if I go to the 3-color KPI here, again, we've got a very similar setup here. Again, with the name, it's a KPI. It's got the same weight. The scoring type is set to 3-color. Again, it's updated on a monthly basis. It's a number type and all that. The difference here is that with 3-color, note that I need to provide a worst value and a red flag value and a goal value and a best. So this is the example that I talked about earlier, where if you're going to use 3-color, you have to provide more than just red flag and goal. You also need to define your own user-provided worst and best so that this KPI understands how, again, to break that all out into a 0 to 10 spectrum of normalized scores. But besides that, everything is largely the same. So that's a quick review of the goal and red flag and 3-color scoring. Jumping back here into my presentation. The next couple KPI types that we'll look at here, scoring types, I should say, that we'll look at, are the kind of binary choices of sort of just red and green. Goal only is an example there, where you, of course, provide a goal. If that goal is met, then the score becomes 10. There's no sense of 6.7, 6.7, or 3.33. It's either you hit your goal or you didn't. If you didn't hit your goal, your normalized score will be 0. If you hit your goal, you get a 10. Another kind of binary approach here is yes and no. And again, you can set it up so that people are simply, when they're inputting values, actual values, and again, the idea would be, did you achieve something? Yes or no? And if it's a no, it'll be a 0. If it's a yes, it'll get a normalized score of 10. You can flip that around, by the way, with regard to yeses and nos. If the answer of yes is actually a bad thing, you know, did we lose 50 customers this month? If the answer is yes, that's bad. So that would get a score of 0 in a red color, and no would get a score of 10 in a green color. And then lastly, in terms of, you know, this binary, just red and green type coloring, is the 2-color scoring, where in this case, you're providing a worst value, a goal value, and a best value. Now, be aware that that goal value does not always have to sit right smack in the middle between your user-defined worst and your user-defined best. The goal can be further over towards best, and it could be further over towards worst. But please be aware that wherever it sits, the goal is going to get a normalized score of 5, regardless of where it sits in the actual performance value spectrum between worst and best. So let's jump out of here and take a quick look at a couple examples of those. Again, I always call them sort of binary scoring types. So we'll start with yes, no, get into edit mode. And this is pretty simple, where if you've set this up to be a yes and no scoring type, there's no need to define certainly any, thresholds, red flags, goals, none of that needs to be defined. The key question that you need to answer here when you set it up as a scoring type of yes, no, is up here towards the upper right, is whether yes is good. So if yes is good, then you say yes. If it's not, then you can make it no. Right? That's the primary setting there for the yes, no. With regard to the goal only, it's again quite similar. Goal only in terms of its setup. Here, again, when you're set up with goal only, towards the upper right again, here the question is, are higher values better, right? So what you're going to be doing is setting up down in the series area an actual, goal or a threshold that is the goal threshold. But then the question is higher than that better, or is higher than that worse, right? So again, you get the choice of yes or no up here. Typically higher is better, but there may be situations where you're gunning after, low numbers. So being higher, again, back to customer churn, higher than 50 is bad. So higher would get a no in this case, right? Okay, so that's the goal only. And then with regard to 2-color, the setup here is very similar to what we saw with the 3-color, except that you're just working with 2. So again, you're going to set it up with a worst threshold, a goal threshold, and a best threshold. All right. Jumping back into my PowerPoint here real quick. Just the last couple of scoring types that we'll cover here are two-color stabilized and unscored. With regard to the unscored, when you set up a KPI as an unscored KPI, be aware that its scoring contribution weight is 0. It's not going to have any impact on higher levels, higher rolled up levels of a KPI area or a scorecard level within your scorecard. This scoring type is most typically used to display targets or forecast data or just generally collect KPI data that might contribute to calculations for other scored KPIs. So the idea is the opportunity to use, Scoreboard as the repository of information that you don't want to score, but you need to have for some other purposes. Again, maybe just defining, a target or a threshold, or contribute again to another calculated KPI. So again, just taking a look at those two scoring types again back in Scoreboard. If we look at the two-color stabilize, I'll just scroll down here, and you'll see that if you set it up with two-color stabilize in the series area, again, you can always set up, your actual value as manual, and then you need to provide a low worst, a low target, a best, a high target, and a high worst. So again, lots of data points that you need to provide to set this up, but this gives you, again, a great opportunity to do something like, again, tracking, warehouse inventory type performance, as we discussed earlier. Okay, and then lastly, let's take a look at unscored. The setup of unscored is about as straightforward as it can be. You, of course, give it whatever name is appropriate, same deal. Note here that the weight, when you set up something as unscored, is 0 in terms of its roll-up weighting. And that is something you cannot change. You don't have any opportunity to say, well, I would like an unscored to have some kind of weight. It will not by default have any weight when scores are rolled up to higher levels. And of course, there's no point in defining any kind of thresholds because you're not scoring it. Your one opportunity here is to define how the actual value will be provided for this particular KPI, whether it be manual or calculated. And roll up would not make any sense at all in this case. So that's the last of our most commonly used scoring types that I wanted to review with you here today. Okay, so the next topic that we'll talk about here is score rollups and weighting, and also some administrative controls that you have over scores and how they're treated and how they work within Scoreboard. In terms of rolling up scores, once any given KPI has been scored, any superior scorecard objects like objectives, perspectives, KPI areas, scorecards, they're all similarly scored by rolling up a weighted average of all the subordinate KPIs. And that's the key, is it's the weighted average. Okay, so just to pictorially cover this and share this with you, the weighted average, right, of your subordinate normalized scores defines the score of the superior object. So on the left, we have, 4 KPIs that are all rolling up to, we'll say that's a KPI area. And the question here is, why did it come up with 7.495 as the score for that KPI area? It's quite simply 3 times the 6.66 plus 1 times the 10 gives you a 19.98 and 10. Add them together, divide them by 4, and you get your 7.495 summarized score. With regard to the right, it's a little different. Again, we have, the same quantity of KPIs. In this case, 3 times the 6.67 plus 1 times the 3.34 gives you, and add those together, gives you a total of 23.44. And again, divide those equally by 4 and you get 5.86. Now, if you take that to a higher, more of a macro level, or imagine you've got many, many, many more KPIs at play rolling up to, again, superior, KPI area levels or even scorecard levels. Again, the same math basically applies. It's just, again, at a larger scale in this case of, how we come up with the 8.26 on the left is, again, 99 times 8.33 to get a number, 1 times the 1.67, add those two totals together, and then divide by the 100 to get your superior, if you will, score of 8.26. And again, on the right, if you have, again, 100 different scores, in this case, more of them are in the red, you're of course going to come up with a lower total when you do the multiplication and the addition. But again, you're dividing equally by 100 to come up with an overall, normalized score for that yellow KPI area of 6.59. Now, what about weight? If we bring weight into play. So in this case, we've got the same subordinate scores on the left and on the right, but different superior scores. Again, this is obviously based on the heavily weighted subordinate KPI over on the right, the big red circle. So again, just to explain how and why this math is done, it's very similar to what we just talked about on the left, with everything being equal in terms of weighting. Again, we're just dividing, equally by 5. On the right, however, because we have set up one KPI to be weighted 9 times more than the rest, we're no longer taking, the total of all the numbers that come out of the multiplication and dividing by 5. Now we're dividing the grand total of the multiplied numbers by 13, because that KPI is weighted 9 times more than the rest. So as an example here, and then one more thing, the color that is displayed for that weighted average score that is calculated for the superior objects is determined by a master setting for non-KPI colors in the application administration. We'll come back to that one in just a second. In the meantime, let's just return to weighting within our scorecard. So in this case, I've got a KPI area called all scoring type KPIs, right? And under it, of course, I've got 13 different KPIs presented here. If I go to any one of them, let's say that I want to make the goal and red flag KPI weighted more heavily than all the other 12 KPIs that roll up to the all scoring type KPIs. What I can do is open that red goal flag KPI in an edit mode, go to the weight setting, and in this case, it shows me all of the myriad KPIs that are under that all KPI area, and I can change the goal and red flag value from here from 1, and we'll use that 9 times more weight than all the others. If I set that to 9, look out on the right and see that what happened was, let me go back. If I set it to 1, note that it's basically dividing the total of 100% down in the lower right, dividing it by 12, and giving each of the KPIs its own unique or individual weight contribution of 8.3, because 12 times 8.3 gives you 100. If I change the goal and red flag to be 9, note that we are now dividing 100 by 20, and so now each single, if you will, weighted unit is only 5%, and my goal and red flag is taking up 9 of those 5%, weighted units. So it's going to be weighted at 45%. Okay. So a real world example of that, I'll get out of here, is if I go out to another scorecard here, we'll go to customer support and take a look at our customer satisfaction area and in here. So you see that in customer satisfaction right now, we have an overall score for this KPI area of 5.9. It is being fed scores by the underlying customer satisfaction survey results and customer churn, right? And we see that customer churn is scored at 3.2 right now. It's in the red. Customer satisfaction survey is at 8.6 as a score, and it's in the green. Well, what if we say, look, customer satisfaction surveys, people hardly ever fill them out anyway. We want customer churn to be more heavily weighted in terms of its contribution to our customer satisfaction score. So what I can do is select customer churn, click edit, go to the customer churn weight, and change it from 1 to 3. And you'll see that customer churn is now going to be 75% of the weight, where customer satisfaction survey is only going to be 25% of the weight. I'll click save. And if I return to that customer, and I'll click done, and if I return to the customer satisfaction KPI area, you'll recall that a minute ago it was at 5.9, and now the score is at 4.5. So that weighting change that I made significantly changed the score that is being rolled up from the underlying KPIs up to the KPI area superior or parent of customer satisfaction. So the key here is that you can change weighting at all the hierarchical levels of your scorecard. You can change weighting at a measure, or sorry, KPI level, of course. You can change weighting, as we just did, at another KPI, a superior KPI level. You can change weighting at a KPI area, and you can change you can't change the weighting at the scorecard level. Okay, but that's the idea behind weighting. Now, to return here one last time here to present what we're going to talk about next, is that the default coloring for things that are not KPIs, those KPI areas or scorecards or what have you, the superiors, as you roll up the scorecard hierarchy, the colors that are applied there is going to be either 3-color, 2-color, or 4-color. 3-color is the default, but you can select 2 or 4-color if that's more appropriate or pertinent to your desires. Now, where you make those settings is in the administrative settings area of Scoreboard, and it's in the configuration area. Under application administration, there's a scoring section, and within that is a non-measure colors setting, which again by default is set to 3-color. Now, I see that I'm quickly starting to run out of time here, but before we leave this, I do want to cover with you just some other administrative controls that you have over scoring. So I'm going to go back in Scoreboard to the settings, administrative settings area, into the application administration area, and I'm going to highlight or focus your attention on the scoring section of the application administration properties. Most of these are pretty straightforward, but I just want to make you aware of their existence and the opportunity you have to make changes. Are scores visible throughout your application? And again, all of these are application-wide kind of master settings. So this isn't something you can change necessarily scorecard to scorecard or organization to organization or measure by measure. This is going to apply to everything throughout your whole Scoreboard application. Are scores visible? Yes or no? You know, you can show colors without necessarily showing the numeric score, and a lot of our customers take advantage of that. Should gray scorecard items be ignored for roll-up? So if any scorecard item has not been scored, it's gray, or it's an unscored KPI and it's gray, it should be ignored for roll-up of scores. By default, what should occur if values are missing? You can treat it as 0, treat it as non-applicable, treat it as blank, or maybe make the entire equation blank. There's an opportunity here to present to someone an N/A option when they are updating actual performance values. This is something that is not on by default, but if you want to give someone the opportunity to just opt out and say, this month I don't have a number for a given KPI, so I want to make it not applicable for this given time period, you can turn that on and someone will have the opportunity to select NA when they're updating a KPI. Here's that setting that we just discussed and your choices in terms of how non-KPIs should be colored. Again, things like KPI areas and scorecards. The enable forward effect scoring is a very, not often, very infrequently employed setting. This basically impacts how Scoreboard treats values at a monthly level when you have set up a KPI to be updated quarterly. So if you've set up a KPI that it's only expecting to be updated quarterly, but you're looking at a line chart at a monthly level, the question is, what should that chart do? What should it present for the months for any given quarter that has not yet been updated? And if you want to carry forward the scores or the scores from the last fully updated quarter into the month presentations for a quarter that has not yet been updated, you can turn this to yes. Again, it's very, very seldom that anyone does that. And then again, the last setting here is what should happen if someone tries to divide by 0? Should it equal 0 or not? Right? And in most cases, the answer is no, which effectively is the same as making the entire equation blank. So it's up to you whether you want to treat something. If a calculation was set up and it ends up with a 0 as the denominator, should it be treated as a numeric 0 and have that score rolled up, or should it just be ignored? We reviewed colors and scores. We introduced you to normalized scoring and colors, the 11 different scoring types we shared with you. We took a little bit of a deeper dive into the most commonly used scoring types, and we discussed score rollups and weighting and some administrative settings. Allow me here to invite you to please join us again in February for our next free Scoreboard webinar. And again, before we stop recording and open this up for any free-form questions you might have, let me just thank you for watching. Again, I invite you to feel free to contact me anytime. Again, I'm Tom Keating, and you can contact me at my personal email or at our education department email at learn@spiderstrategies.com.